Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. So just as I sat down to record the introduction to today's episode, in my inbox landed this statement from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and I'll read it in full. Yemen is now in imminent danger of the worst famine the world has seen in decades. In the absence of immediate action, millions of lives may be lost. This arises from the combination of a drastic reduction in funding for the UN-coordinated relief operation this year compared to 2018 and 2019, a failure to sustain external support for Yemen's economy, especially in stabilizing the value of the Yemeni rial, and the impact of the ongoing conflict and impediments imposed by powerful Yemeni and other parties on the life-saving work of humanitarian agencies. Locusts and floods compound these problems. The statement continues, I urge all those with influence to act urgently on these issues to stave off catastrophe, and I also request that everyone avoids taking any action that could make the already dire situation even worse. Failing that, we risk a tragedy not just in the immediate loss of life, but with the consequences that will reverberate indefinitely into the future. End quote. I think that statement from the Secretary General sets up today's episode quite well. On the line is filmmaker Skye Fitzgerald. His new film, Hunger Ward, gives viewers a vivid account of how the war in Yemen is causing widespread starvation and malnutrition among Yemeni children. In the film, he documents the work of doctors and healthcare providers in two separate hospitals who specialize in treating acute malnutrition in children. It is an intense, but I think a vital film that in many ways humanizes statements like that one from the Secretary General. You can learn more about how to access the film by going to hungerward.org. In our conversation, we don't get too deep into the causes and history of the Yemen conflict, though I have done a number of episodes on this crisis over the years that I encourage you to download if you've not already. So just briefly and by way of background, the conflict in Yemen essentially pits a group called the Houthis against the internationally recognized government of Yemen. In 2014 and early 2015, the Houthis made major gains, including capturing the capital city Sana'a. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia intervened against the Houthis, and they led a coalition that included the United Arab Emirates, among others, and this coalition was backed by the United States. Today, Saudi Arabia essentially controls all air and sea traffic to Yemen, which is significant because Yemen imports most of its food. And it's also worth mentioning that in parallel to the fighting, there's a kind of economic warfare between the sides that is causing inflation and driving up food prices. Again, this is a superficial description of the conflict, and I'll post a link in the show notes to episodes that discuss the conflict itself in greater detail. For now, here is my conversation with filmmaker Skye Fitzgerald.
Yeah, so Hunger Ward is the third film in a trilogy that I'm doing. The first was called 50 Feet from Syria, where we followed a Syrian-American doctor to the border between Turkey and Syria and sort of documented his work as a volunteer surgeon, working to assist refugees with traumatic injuries from the war in Syria. And that project led directly to the second film in the trilogy called Lifeboat, where we documented search and rescue operations off the coast of Libya from asylum seekers and economic migrants who were fleeing really austere conditions in northern Africa to try to reach Europe. And this film, Hunger Ward, is the third of these three, all with sort of some sort of undercurrent of either a focus on refugees, asylum seekers, or IDPs, internally displaced people. And one has sort of flowed directly into the other, frankly. This film, in part, was certainly inspired by the work of some of my colleagues in journalism, especially photographers who have made it into Yemen over the last handful of years, who have just done really hard, difficult, inspiring work. I think of fantastic journalists like Lindsay Addario and Tyler Hicks and Giles Clark, who have all been able to get in and really show the world what's happening on the ground and the impact of the war, specifically on civilians.
I know for a while it's been very difficult for journalists to get into Yemen. I remember seeing, for example, the BBC reporter Orla Guerin had this harrowing story 6 years ago about having to basically sneak aboard a shipping vessel that left Djibouti for Yemen because the Saudi government essentially controls air traffic in and out of the country, and they will not let permits in for journalists.
Very true. Very true. And that was our experience as well, frankly. So it took me 8 months of very difficult sort of behind the scenes work in order to gain access to the country. And that was from the time that we actually started to get access to visas, because you don't want to enter the country without the proper paperwork. It has been done. But when it is done, because it's a police state in the north and sort of a very dangerous state of affairs in the south in terms of foreigners being kidnapped, and tortured and then ransomed, that you really have to have the paperwork in order to operate. And so it took us 8.5 months or so from the time we started to get our visas. And it's because of what you noted, that the foreign powers that control the country to a great extent, with the air blockade, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the US to some extent, really control access to the airports, as well as the seaport of Hodeidah. And then in the north of the country, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, of course, it's a police state, and you can't go anywhere without them knowing it. And so you really have to do that hard work to make contacts on the ground and communicate clearly what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And even then, you have to pull whatever strings you can find to get the paperwork. And if you don't do that, then you will be jailed. And I have a colleague right now who has been in prison in southern Yemen for the past 6 weeks for simply doing his job, because the authorities didn't want him to get the story out. And so, they don't want to issue visas to journalists because they don't necessarily want people in the West especially to know how bad conditions are or why they're as bad as they are.
Were you filming in the sort of internationally recognized Saudi-backed government-controlled area or Houthi-controlled areas?
We were able to gain access to both parts of the country. So we filmed about half of the film in the south, which is theoretically controlled by, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and supported by the U.S. So we filmed basically half of our story there, and then we also were able to get permission from the Houthis to work in the north for 2 weeks as well. So we were in the rebel-held north, held by Ansar Allah, for half of the filming. Just to unpack that a little bit, so you have a sense of what that means, right? So that took 8 months to get that paperwork, right? And then to travel from one part of the country to the other, from the south to the north in this instance, that's you can't fly in. The only flights into the north that are allowed by the Saudi coalition are the UN flights, right, that come in from time to time. And so you have to go overland. And the road between, Aden in the south and Sana'a in the north is not in good shape because of the war. So it took us about 15 hours and 25 checkpoints that we had to make it through just to travel from south to north. It's pretty arduous at this point.
Are you crossing basically front lines at that point?
Yeah, you can be depending on where the front is at any given point because the front moves, right? And so what they try to do, the reason it takes so long is because they continually reroute certain sections of the road to avoid the front line. And so we didn't have to drive through active fighting, but it meant that we were going through, roads in quotes, right? A road that had been created. There was really just two tracks in the sand to circumvent the front line, and that road changes whenever it needs to, which sometimes is on a weekly basis.
Can you describe for me the first hospital that you visited, that you filmed in the southern part of the country, which is, again, the sort of internationally recognized government, the Saudi-backed coalition, the Saudi coalition, backed by the U.S. and other countries, ostensibly in control of this area. Can you describe that hospital?
Yes, Sadaka Hospital is this large facility that was built by a Russian architect, maybe in the 70s, I guess, actually. So it's a really unusual looking building shaped sort of like a boomerang. It's 5 floors tall. And it is sort of the place where all of the worst malnutrition cases in the south of the country eventually migrate to, because they have a ward, a pediatric ward in particular, dedicated to malnutrition. And when a child is dying of starvation, they need it's specialty care. You can't just hand them food or the proper nutrients and expect them to recover, because the body's, as a child, especially when children are growing, they need very long-term specialty care in order to recover properly and avoid stunting. And so this hospital in particular has highly trained staff, not many resources, but highly trained staff that's really dedicated to this demographic in Yemen, which is starving children, unfortunately, is a large demographic. And so what happens is that when a child begins to die of starvation in the south of Yemen, and they go to their local clinic, if there is a local clinic any longer, then almost always they're referred to Sadaka Hospital in Aden, the capital in the south of the moment. And there they can receive good pediatric care that often will save the child's life. It's a very austere place without many resources in terms of tech, but the knowledge base there is deep. And we worked with a female doctor, Dr. Aida Al-Sadiq, who has been the managing pediatrician there for years, and in my view, is just an absolute hero. Does this thankless work for virtually no pay and saves countless children's lives day in and day out, despite the very difficult nature of the work.
In the course of filming and reporting your documentary, did you come to know any of the backstories of the children and their families whose, lives and whose illness and suffering you depicted in the film?
Well, we did learn the backstories, and that's part of my task as a filmmaker is, first off, these are really intimate stories, and you can't, in my view, really tell a heartfelt, intimate story without trust. And so we spent a good chunk of our time not only developing trust with the doctors and nurses beforehand, before landing in the country, but then, with the families that we met while we were embedded in these facilities. And so, I can name Omema, for example, who was a 10-year-old girl treated by Dr. Aida in Sadaka Hospital, who weighed 24 pounds. And, Mark, I have a 10-year-old son here in the U.S. who weighs 95 pounds. And so, that's a pretty stark contrast. And as a human being, as a filmmaker, as a father, I'm horrified by that fact. And so, of course, we want to learn as much about how that came to be as we could. And in Omema's case, her family was displaced by the fighting multiple times. The male members of her family were fishermen, and there were multiple attacks on fishermen by the Saudi coalition, one by helicopter gunship, and so they couldn't even fish for a long period of time, and that impacted the family's ability to earn a living. And then on top of that, because they did have access to food, the World Food Program operations in the country for a while, they were able to get sort of grain in order to just supplement, their diet. But unfortunately, because she ate grain as a young child for so long, that her body developed celiac disease. And so she became allergic, and she couldn't retain the proper nutrients from the diet she had, and so she just started to waste away, but no one knew why. And so we learned about that whole backstory and about sort of the complex interplay between the war and the displacement, the lack of livelihood, but also sort of how even when there is aid, sometimes it can complicate a child's life if that's what they're relying upon, right? Which was Omema's case. The grain actually ultimately affected her ability to process nutrients. So in each case, we sort of learned those details as we followed her.
So as you mentioned earlier, you also depict and document a hunger ward, a similar sort of pediatric ward, though this time in Houthi-controlled territory in the north of the country. What was the same and what was different about that pediatric ward as opposed to the one in the government-controlled territory?
Right. Well, we very consciously chose to work with two female healthcare workers in both the North and the South because it's a divided country right now, and we wanted to show how these stories played out in different parts of the country. And remarkably, despite the fact that Sadaka, is in the city of Aden, and the clinic that we covered in the north is very much a rural clinic, what we found was a very similar set of conditions that were facing the physicians and similar conditions facing the children as well. And so both lacked basic resources and relied heavily on just the talent and deep knowledge set of the physicians and the nurses working in each facility. In each case, what we found, there was a common challenge faced by the families in the North and the South to simply get the children from where they were experiencing, crippling malnutrition to the facility where they could actually get the help. So there were long journeys involved that were really costly for the families. And that was one of the major hurdles for families seeking help for their children, was they simply, it was cost prohibitive for them to even catch a taxi or to travel the long distance to get care. So there were a lot of commonalities despite the fact that the country is divided. And we also found that there were challenges, shall we say, facing the physicians who needed basic foodstuffs and certain types of nutrients. They oftentimes would have to fight very hard to gain access to certain types of milk products, for example, that they would have to give children of different ages, because different products are given to children depending on their age and their weight. So there were a lot of commonalities between the two areas, actually.
So you briefly mentioned this, but both of the doctors that you depicted, that you documented in the film were women, and most of the healthcare workers, it seemed from the film, were women as well, and most of the patients were young girls. I guess, was this like an editorial decision, or is this like a reflection of the gender dynamics at play in Yemen concerning who is suffering from hunger and who are the frontline medical workers treating pediatric malnutrition?
In terms of the patients, that was not an editorial decision. That was really just purely a practical function of the families who we met with in both the facilities and the timing of their admission and discharge while we were filming. What we found, both in talking to Dr. Aida in the South, who does a lot of statistical work on malnutrition in Yemen, is that across genders, it's pretty even in terms of children experiencing malnutrition. It's just that Omeima and Abir, the two young girls that we follow in the film, their families were very open to participating in the project, and they happened to be admitted and discharged on a cycle that we could capture as fully as possible. In terms of the doctors, both Dr. Aida in the South and Makia Maji in the North, in my view, are really heroes. I mean, they're women doing this very difficult work, mostly unheralded, that I wanted to showcase. I wanted to show that some of the most difficult work is being done by these women because they feel an ethical obligation to do it. And that's not to say that there aren't, wonderful, dedicated male doctors as well doing the work we experienced. We met many of them. But I really did want to shine a light on Aida and Makia because I felt like especially in a country like Yemen where, the dynamics between women and men is not even. I really wanted to showcase the work of these what I think are very heroic Yemeni women.
I'm curious to learn from you, what's driving the sharp increase in acute malnutrition among children under the age of 5 in Yemen today?
Well, it's that's been the case for some time, right? I mean, there's not a single answer to that question. There's a multiplicity of answers, and they're all true and they're all factors. So I'll just lay some of those out, I guess. Certainly the advent of COVID in the short term has exacerbated the situation because flights in and out of the country are incredibly limited, even more limited than when we were there in the first 2 months of this year. The pandemic has also affected aid, right? And the level of aid that has been flowing into the country. The drop in dollars supporting the World Food Program operations in country has dropped precipitously since COVID because countries have just simply stopped meeting their obligations and commitments to fund the World Food Program in the country, despite the fact that Yemen is the biggest World Food Program operation in the world that they operate. So there's been an incredible drop in aid, and that's been an influencing factor. But underlying that, of course, are the foundational issues of the conflict itself. The fact is, the Saudi coalition has had and continues to hold an air blockade over the country. And no one flies in without the Saudis saying you can fly in. And that really deeply affects a lot of things, including the ability of foodstuffs to enter the country, medicine to enter the country, and people to seek medical care out of the country. There's also a sea blockade at the port of Hodeidah, which is a contested port. So the amount and number of food shipments that would typically come in are sort of bound by the Saudis in terms of what can come into the country. And then, the war has really deeply compounded the underlying poverty in the country. So inflation is really has risen incredibly during the course of the conflict, which means that even when there is food available, and there's food available in many parts of the country, you can walk into a market in Sana'a and there's plenty of food, but people simply can't afford it. And so that's the other piece of this is that, the banking system has been shut down because of the Saudis coalition's, intervention. And so there's no functional banking system in the country. And that has meant that the black market really thrives, but it means that prices are out of control as well. And people often just can't buy the food they need. So that's those are some of the issues at play, and they all sort of interrelate with each other and work together.
And finally, Like, how can people access your film? Was there like a theatrical release? I don't know the terms of art here. I'm sorry. Could you tell me what I should ask?
No, it's okay. So cinema in the time of COVID, is a tricky thing, right? Because in most parts of the country, we simply can't go and sit in a theater right now and watch a film, as we all know. And so, our industry is facing this challenge like many other industries. So what we're doing is we're releasing the film via virtual film festivals throughout the fall. And then eventually we will release it via traditional distributor as well. For now, the easiest way to watch the film is to check our website, which is hungerward.org. And we're launching at the Holly Shorts Film Festival mid-November. And we'll have all the information about that on our website at hungerward.org. So we're going to do a series of film festival launches and then with the distributor deeper into the fall.
Great. Well, thank you so much and congratulations on the film.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Skye Fitzgerald. And again, please visit hungerward.org to learn more about the film. All right. We will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.